Kate wasn't like other girls her age. At 16, while her friends talked about parties and boys, she struggled to keep up with the household bills. With a sick mother and an absent father, Kate split her time between school and her job at a local diner. The nights were long, and fatigue seemed to accumulate on her shoulders, but she didn't complain. It was all she knew. The aroma of coffee and fried food clung to her uniform, and the routine of serving hurried customers left little room for her own dreams. It was on a stuffy summer afternoon that she met Tom. He was 18, with a smile that seemed to illuminate the shadowy corners of her soul, and a confidence that contrasted with Kate's silent insecurity. He used to sit at the diner's counter, sometimes with a book in hand, other times just watching the busy street. Kate's gaze followed him, even when she tried to focus on orders. One night, after weeks of exchanging furtive glances, Tom approached the counter while Kate was cleaning the area. "You work too hard," he said with a half-smile. Kate, surprised, dropped the cloth on the floor. I need to. I don't have much choice," she replied, a little embarrassed. Tom leaned in, his gaze fixed on hers. "Nobody should work that hard, especially someone like you." There was something in his voice, a tenderness that Kate rarely heard, something that made her feel seen, something that didn't come from fatigue or obligation, but from something deeper. Days passed, and conversations between them became more frequent. Sometimes, they walked to the park after Kate's shift, where they sat in silence, watching the sun disappear on the horizon. Other times, they talked about dreams that Kate had long buried. With Tom, she felt free. For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future different from the one reality imposed. One late afternoon, the sky tinged red, Tom looked at Kate in a way she would never forget. Without saying a word, he took her hand. The touch was gentle, but loaded with unspoken promises. They knew what was to come, but said nothing. A few months later, Kate began to feel something strange in her body. At first, she ignored it, thinking it was just stress. But as the days passed, the sensation became undeniable. The nausea, the exhaustion, the growing fear. A drugstore test confirmed what her heart already knew. Pregnant. She sat on the bathroom floor, her trembling hands holding the small device. Silent tears fell on her face. She didn't know what to do. Her world, which was already precarious, now seemed to be crumbling. That night, she met Tom in the park. He noticed the change in her eyes, something dark that wasn't there before. "What's wrong, Kate?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of each word before saying, "I'm pregnant, Tom." The silence that followed was painful, a void that seemed to stretch for miles between them. Tom looked at the ground, his fists clenched. After a long moment, he finally said, "We'll figure it out." But Kate knew it wasn't that simple. She loved Tom, more than she ever imagined loving someone, but she couldn't ignore the reality that surrounded them. Rain was falling heavily that morning when Tom prepared to talk to Kate's mother. She watched him from the window, the gray sky reflecting the whirlwind of feelings in her chest. Tom had a serious expression. His eyes didn't hide the concern, but there was a firmness in his posture that Kate admired. When he returned, soaked and with a closed face, Kate already knew the conversation hadn't been easy. "She doesn't even want to hear about us, not now," Tom said, running his hand through his wet hair. "But I'm not going to let you go through this alone." The following days were of silent change. Kate packed her few clothes in an old backpack, and together they moved into a small trailer borrowed from a friend of Tom's. The space was cramped, the walls thin, and the roof seemed to creak with every gust of wind. But for Kate, it was a refuge. With Tom by her side, she had the illusion that everything could work out. Mornings were filled with brief laughter and small joys. Tom left early for work at the local grocery store, and Kate, even tired from pregnancy, strived to keep the trailer tidy. The baby moved in her belly, a constant reminder of the future that was about to crumble. But hope didn't last long. In the 8th month of pregnancy, Kate was called to the office of the diner where she worked. The manager, a man with a hoarse voice and cold gaze, stared at her indifferently. "You can't work here anymore, Kate," Not in this state. She tried to protest, explain that she needed the job, but the words died in her throat. The decision had already been made, and when she left the place, a feeling of helplessness enveloped her like a cloak. Without her salary, the financial burden fell entirely on Tom's shoulders. His smile became rarer, and the nights, once full of conversations, became long and silent. One day, Tom came home exhausted, his eyes sunken with fatigue, and Kate knew he was on the verge of collapse. "We can't go on like this, Kate," he said, his voice choked. "I can barely pay for the basics." She watched him for a moment, feeling the pain in every word. The future they had imagined together seemed so distant, so out of reach. "I know, Tom," she replied, her voice soft but determined. "I've thought a lot about this, and I think the best thing I can do for our child is to let him have a better life. I can't give him what he deserves." Tom fell silent, his eyes filling with tears he tried to hold back. "You want to give up our child?" he murmured, as if he couldn't believe the words. Kate felt her heart break, but she knew it was the right decision. "It's not what I want, but it's what he needs." The following days were a blur of tears and silent conversations. Kate wrote the letter that would be left with the baby. Her hands trembled as she tried to put into words everything her heart felt, but she knew she could never fully express it. On the night before the birth, Tom lay down next to Kate, his face close to hers. "Do you still want to do this?" he whispered, desperation present in every syllable. "I don't want to, Tom," she replied with tears in her eyes. "But what else can we do?" The next morning, Kate was taken to the hospital. The birth was painful, physically and emotionally. When the baby was finally born, she held him for brief minutes. Her eyes met her son's, and she felt as if the world around her was silent, as if everything had stopped. But there was no time. His cry echoed in the room as they placed him in her arms for the last time. Tom was by her side, his face devastated, unable to hide the pain. "I love you," she whispered to the baby, while leaving the letter in his blanket. "I love you so much that I need to let you go." And then she handed him over. Peter could never explain the emptiness that had accompanied him since childhood. He grew up in a house full of love, with adoptive parents who never failed to provide affection or support. But there was something, a silent absence that filled the lonely moments, a space within him that not even the smiles of his adoptive parents could reach. At 20, sitting at the kitchen table, he looked at the time-yellowed letter his birth mother had left. So many times he had read it, so many times he had imagined the face behind the words. Asterisk, "I love you. This is the hardest decision of my life, but I'm doing this for you, to give you a better chance." Asterisk, he could recite every line from memory. Finally, after months of searching, Peter found a lead. A small town just 150 miles from where he grew up. She was there, his mother, working at a diner in the neighboring town. Curiosity was eating him alive. As he arrived, his heart was beating so hard he could hear it in his ears. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of the small restaurant, casting shadows over the tables. He entered, each step seeming like a forced act of courage. Then he saw her, at the counter serving coffee. Kate, his mother. She looked younger than he had imagined, perhaps because his mind had always portrayed her as a distant and painful memory. She wore a worn apron, her hair tied back practically, and her face bore traces of weariness. Peter sat at one of the tables near the window, his hands sweating as he tried to organize his thoughts. Asterisk, what should I say? How do I approach her? Asterisk. Minutes later, Kate approached with a gentle smile, unaware that fate was looking her directly in the eyes. "What can I get you, son?" she asked, her voice sweet but laden with a lifetime of struggles. Peter stared at her for a few seconds, as if searching for the courage he lacked. "A coffee, please," he replied, his voice a little hoarse, trying to disguise his agitation. She jotted down the order and, with a slight nod, walked away. As Kate prepared the coffee, Peter wondered if she would feel something, any recognition. He watched her back, each simple and automatic movement. He wanted to talk to her, wanted to ask everything, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. When she returned, she placed the coffee in front of him, her eyes meeting his for a moment longer than before. A small trace of something passed across Kate's face. Curiosity, perhaps. "Are you from around here?" she asked casually, while wiping the table next to him. Peter hesitated before answering. "No, not exactly. I'm just passing through." "I see. Are you looking for something?" The question was innocent, but to Peter it felt like a punch. He lowered his gaze to the coffee cup and said softly, almost to himself, "Yeah, I guess I am." Kate frowned slightly, as if sensing there was something more to those words. But, as so often in life, she didn't have time for daydreams. She just smiled again and went back to work. Peter stayed there for over an hour, watching her from afar. Every smile, every gesture. He wanted to speak, wanted to shout that he was her son, that the emptiness inside him needed the answers that only she could give. But he couldn't. The fear of how she would react paralyzed him. When he finally left the diner that afternoon, the sound of the bell on the door echoed behind him. And, although nothing had been said, something had changed. With each trip, the road seemed longer to Peter, but he couldn't help it. 3 times a week, he would get in the car and drive the 150 miles that separated him from Kate. Always the same route, always the same destination. Anticipation consumed him, but the fear of how it could all end prevented him from moving forward. Each mile was a mixture of hope and anxiety. When he arrived at the restaurant, he would enter and sit at the same table near the window. Kate would serve him with the same kindness as always, but without any sign of recognition. She was so distant and, at the same time, so close. Every word exchanged with her was a piece of an incomplete conversation, a bridge to something he didn't have the courage to cross. On one of these visits, as she served him a slice of apple pie, Peter tried, once again, to initiate a dialogue that might bridge the distance between them. "Have you been working here long?" he asked, his voice faltering as he stirred his coffee cup. Kate paused for a second, the tray still in her hands. "A few years. Maybe 7, 8 years. I've lost count." She gave a slight smile, but there was a weight to her words that Peter felt immediately. "And before that?" he pressed, trying to extract more, hoping that somehow it would bring something from the past to the surface. She looked at him, her brown eyes shining with a distant memory, but quickly looked away. "A lot of things. You know how it is. Life isn't easy." Kate sighed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "But don't get me wrong. I'm grateful for this place. It gave me some stability. After everything." "After everything?" Peter repeated, trying to sound casual, but his heart racing. He needed to know. Kate shrugged, as if this was a subject she had learned to bury. "We make choices. Sometimes they're the right ones, other times, not so much." She was about to walk away, but Peter couldn't let her go without trying one more time. He gripped the napkin in his hands tightly, tension consuming him. "Have you ever regretted anything?" The question came out more desperate than he intended. Kate stopped again, this time for longer. She stared at Peter with a curious look, as if finally realizing there was something more behind this customer who was always there. But even so, she didn't seem ready to unearth the past. "Everyone regrets something," she answered softly, before walking away in silence. Peter watched as she walked away, her words echoing in his mind. With each encounter, the chasm between them seemed to grow. He wanted so badly to tell the truth, to reveal that he was her son, that she was the answer to the emptiness that had consumed him for 20 years. But the fear of being rejected, of opening a wound that maybe she never wanted to revisit, held him back. In the following days, the routine repeated itself. Peter would enter, sit at the same table, and exchange glances with Kate. Each conversation, however superficial, seemed charged with an invisible tension, as if both felt there was something more unsaid. On one of the last visits, when Kate brought the usual coffee, she stared at him longer than usual. "Where did you say you were from again?" she asked, tilting her head slightly, as if something about Peter seemed familiar to her. Peter took a deep breath, struggling to maintain his composure. From a town not too far from here, but I don't always come from there. She frowned, as if trying to remember something, but ended up just shaking her head. Well, wherever you're from, it seems you really like apple pie. He smiled, trying to hide the turmoil happening inside him. Maybe it's something familiar, he replied in a tone he couldn't quite control, the words heavy with meaning. But Kate didn't notice, or chose not to notice. The night was cold, and the cutting wind made Peter huddle in his coat as he waited in the nearly empty parking lot. The diner's lights flickered in the distance, creating a soft glow on the wet asphalt from the recent rain. The sound of cars passing in the distance seemed muffled by the weight of the decision he was about to make. He held the letter with trembling hands, the time-yellowed paper seeming heavier than ever. 3 months. 3 months of exchanged glances, casual conversations, and a secret that was about to be revealed. Peter knew he couldn't wait any longer. The emptiness inside him demanded answers, and he desperately needed the reconnection he had always dreamed of. Finally, Kate appeared, coming out of the back door of the diner, the fatigue visible in her slumped shoulders. She adjusted her coat, looked around, and stopped when she saw Peter leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. "Peter, what are you doing here at this hour?" she asked, surprised and somewhat worried, as she slowly approached. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took the letter from his pocket, the paper folded and worn from being read so many times. When he extended his hand to give it to her, the air seemed heavier between them. Kate looked at the letter, and her face changed. The color drained from her cheeks, and a painful understanding began to form in her eyes. "It can't be," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the paper as if she were seeing a ghost. Peter swallowed hard, trying to contain the emotion rising in his throat. "It's you, the woman who wrote this letter," he said softly, his voice faltering. "I'm the son you left behind." Kate took a step back, her hand covering her mouth as tears began to stream down her face. "Oh my God! Oh my God! It can't be!" Her voice failed, and before Peter could say anything else, she crossed the space between them and hugged him with a strength he never imagined. She cried uncontrollably on his shoulder, sobs coming from the depths of a soul marked by loss and regret. "I thought I'd never see you again. Never. Oh God, thank you." Her words came out in fragments, and she held Peter as if he might disappear at any moment. Peter stood still at first, the familiar scent of his mother, the warmth of the embrace. Everything seemed so surreal. He closed his eyes, feeling her damp cheek against his neck, the sobs reverberating in his chest. Finally, he hugged her back, tightly, as if trying to make up for lost time. I've been looking for you for so long," he murmured, his voice choked. "I had to know why you left me." Kate pulled away for a moment, her hands still holding his arms, her gaze one of pure disbelief, as if she were in a dream. I didn't want to leave you. Never wanted to." She caressed his face with trembling fingers, tears still rolling down her cheeks. "I thought you'd have a better life without me. I did what I thought was right, but, God, it hurt every day." She rested her forehead against his, still crying, her body shaking with emotion. "Forgive me, Peter. Please forgive me. I never meant to hurt you." Peter, his eyes watery, caressed his mother's face, feeling the weight of years of distance, doubts, the emptiness he carried. "I just wanted to find you," he whispered, his voice broken. "I just wanted to know you." They stood there, embracing in the deserted parking lot, the world around them disappearing. Kate held Peter, but her mind was racing, transporting her back to the past. His face, so similar to what she remembered of the baby she held for a few minutes before handing him over to the social worker, made every wound open again. As she hugged him, her thoughts pulled her back to the day when she, young and scared, wrote the letter. Sitting at a simple wooden table, with a yellowed sheet of paper and a cheap pen. The words came out with difficulty, interspersed with sobs, her heart heavy with the burden of choice. "My dear son," she wrote, her hands trembling, tears falling on the page and smudging the ink. Asterisk. "This is the hardest decision I've ever made, but it's out of love for you. I can't give you the life you deserve. I hope someday you'll understand me." Asterisk. Now, with Peter in her arms, she wondered if he understood her, or if he hated her. How could he forgive her after everything? She gently let him go, facing his eyes full of questions, pain, and a need she knew so well. Guilt consumed her, like a fire burning her insides. I didn't know what to do," she whispered, her voice broken. "I was so young, so lost. I had nothing to offer you. That day, it felt like I was saving you, but every day after that, I wondered if I'd lost you forever." Peter didn't look away, his eyes full of pain, but also something Kate couldn't identify. "I spent my whole life wondering why," he said, his voice low. "I knew it had been a difficult choice, but that didn't make the emptiness go away." Kate took a deep breath, tears flowing freely down her face. "I wrote that letter, thinking it was the only way to give you a chance, but it hurt. It hurt so much, and I wonder, every day, if I could have done better, given you the life you deserved, if I had just fought harder." She placed her hand on her chest, as if she could touch the pain that never really went away. "I wanted to hold you, Peter, keep you with me, but the world wasn't kind to me, and I wondered if it would be fair to let you go through all that too." Peter looked at her, the silence between them heavy. "I just wanted to know who you were for so long, and now that I'm here, I just feel like maybe I've lost you too." Kate sobbed, holding his face in her hands. "I never stopped loving you. Never. Even when I gave you up, even when I closed the orphanage door, I took you with me. In every tear, in every regret, you were with me." Kate's words were like stabs to her own soul. She felt the weight of every wrong decision, of every time she had convinced herself it was best for him. The relief of seeing him there, of having him in her arms, was intertwined with the cruel regret of a mother who felt she had failed. "Please," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible. "Please tell me you were happy, that what I did was worth it, that you didn't have a childhood with difficulties." The night was cold, but Kate didn't stop asking about Peter's life as they walked to the apartment. Kate clutched the apartment key in her hands, her heart racing at the idea of introducing Peter to Tom, the man who never knew how to deal with the loss of the son he never saw grow up. As they reached the door of the small apartment, Kate took a deep breath and looked at Peter. He never stopped thinking about you," she said softly, her voice choked with emotion. "I just never knew how to forgive myself. You were our son, our baby." Peter just nodded, not knowing what to say. It wasn't just his story that was being unearthed, but that of an entire family torn apart by time and circumstances. Kate opened the door, revealing the modest but cozy space. The small living room had a wooden table with a vase of dried flowers in the center, a worn sofa that showed signs of years of use, and the walls were decorated with faded photos of simpler times. Tom was sitting at the table reading an old newspaper. Hearing the door open, he looked up and smiled when he saw Kate, but his smile disappeared when he saw Peter beside her. His eyes widened, as if he were facing a ghost, unable to believe what he saw. "Tom," Kate began, her voice trembling. "This is Peter." Tom stood up abruptly, the newspaper falling to the floor, but he didn't care. "Peter," he repeated, almost breathless, his voice hoarse with surprise and repressed emotion. Peter stepped forward, feeling a lump in his throat. "It's me, Dad." The word Dad echoed through the apartment, as if time had stopped for a second. Tom blinked, his eyes filling with tears that he tried, unsuccessfully, to hold back. "You? Is it really you?" He took another step forward, hesitant, as if he didn't believe it was real. Peter nodded slowly, and in an instant, Tom pulled him into a tight hug, tears finally rolling down his cheeks. I dreamed of this moment so many times," Tom whispered, his voice choked. I thought I'd never have this chance. Peter closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of his biological father's embrace for the first time. The weight of all the years they had been apart seemed to dissolve for a moment, as if time had stopped, and somehow they could start again. Kate, watching the two, couldn't hold back her own tears. She sat down on the couch, her hands trembling, and for a moment, she just watched the scene she never imagined she'd witness. The pain, the guilt, the regret. It was all there, but there was something more, something new, something that, despite the deep scars, seemed ready to bloom. After what felt like an eternity, Tom released Peter, still keeping his hands on his son's shoulders, studying him as if seeing a piece of himself. "You look so much like me. And her," he said with a sad, nostalgic smile. "It's like looking at the past, but also at the future." Peter tried to speak, but his voice failed. He simply nodded, feeling the weight of everything. I don't know what to say. I spent so long wondering who you were. Why all of this happened." Tom took a deep breath, searching for the right words. We were young, Peter. Young and scared. I wasn't ready to be a father, and when I found out you wouldn't be with us, it felt like losing a part of myself. And I guess I never really forgave myself for not fighting harder. Kate, now sitting quietly, clutched her chest, feeling the guilt that had consumed her for years. But seeing the two of them together, she knew that despite everything, there was a chance to rebuild something, even if it didn't erase what they had lived apart. "I asked myself why," Peter finally said, his voice stronger now. "But I think now I just want to understand. And maybe start over." Tom cleared his throat, his voice cracking. "Peter, it was never easy for us," he began, his eyes avoiding his son's, fixed on the empty cup in front of him. "The decision to give you up was the worst day of our lives." Kate's hands trembled in her lap. "I thought I was protecting you, but the pain of not having you never went away." She looked up, her eyes meeting Peter's, tears threatening to fall. "Every day after you were gone, it was like waking up to a nightmare. Every birthday, every Christmas, every little moment was a reminder of what we lost." Tom sighed, running his hand through his graying hair. "We tried to move on, but we never could. The pain of knowing you were out there, somewhere, but that we weren't there for you. It was too much. We tried to build a life, but it always felt incomplete." Peter listened in silence, their words hitting him like blows to the chest. He felt the weight of the guilt, but also something new, an understanding that they had been victims of the same circumstances, trapped in the web of difficult choices. "I wondered why you didn't have other children," Peter murmured, breaking the silence. "I always imagined. Maybe you moved on." Kate shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "We tried. For a while, we thought maybe having another child would fill the emptiness. But every time I thought about it, it felt like betraying you, like we were trying to replace what we lost. And I knew no child we had could ever fill the place you left." Tom looked at Peter, finally meeting his gaze. "The truth is, neither of us felt worthy. How could we bring another child into the world, knowing you were out there, wondering why we gave you up?" Peter felt the weight of those words, his hands trembling. "I never knew that," he said quietly. "I always thought you had forgotten me, that maybe I didn't matter." Kate gasped, her eyes wide with shock. "Forget you? God, Peter, I spent every second of my life thinking about you. When I gave you up, it was to give you a better life, to protect you. But I never forgot you." Tom nodded, his eyes also filled with tears. "Neither did I. Not a day went by that I didn't think about how things could have been different, how I could have fought harder. But life, it broke us. The shame, the guilt, it consumed us." Peter took a deep breath, trying to process everything. I guess I never realized how much you suffered too," he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. "I always thought you had moved on, while I was here, stuck with all these questions." Kate reached across the table, hesitant, before gently touching Peter's hand. We were stuck too, son, trapped in a cycle of regret, fear, and loss. We never moved on. We never became whole again. Tom leaned forward, his face marked by time and pain. Maybe all three of us were victims of the same choices. You had your life, but we carried our own kind of suffering. Now, here we are, trying to pick up the pieces. The small kitchen fell silent again, except for the soft sound of the wind against the window. Peter looked at his biological parents, feeling something profound and devastating. The realization that they weren't the monsters he had imagined. They were just people broken by circumstances, struggling with guilt and regret, just like him.